This presentation will be given in English, but if you would prefer to hear it in Spanish, you can click the globe icon if you're on a laptop or desktop device at the bottom menu and choose your language. If you're on choose Spanish if you prefer. If you are on a mobile device, then you can click the three dots and choose language interpretation and then choose Spanish. Esta presentación se va a dar en inglés, pero va a haber interpretación simultánea al español. Si prefieren escuchar en español, pueden hacer clic en el icono que se mira como un globo en la parte inferior de la pantalla. En el menú de opciones, elegir el Language Interpretation, interpretación del lenguaje, y escoger idioma español. Si están utilizando un dispositivo móvil, entonces sería picándole a los tres puntitos y eligiendo Language Interpretation, interpretación del lenguaje, y eligiendo el español.
Thank you, Ben. I think we'll go ahead and get started now. So everyone, welcome to the Know Your Rights training with the National Lawyers Guild. My name is Ari Wood, and I am the Hecker Community Fellow for the Community Engagement Center. And the Community Engagement Center is sponsoring this event today. At the CEC, we support students, faculty, and community members by nurturing and fostering campus community partnerships and courses and events such as this one. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Shani, who is the intern for our direct action pillar.
Hi all, thank you so much for being here today. I apologize that my camera's off and having some Wi-Fi issues, so I hope you'll forgive me speaking out of the void a little bit. But yes, I am so grateful to be working for the Direct Action Pillar of the Community Engagement Center at Pitzer, which holds the goal of organizing and educating with the Pitzer community to take real and immediate action to better the communities we are a part of by uplifting existing community organizing and direct action efforts that align with our values at the Community Engagement Center. Yeah, that's pretty much the goal of our work. And I'm also going to allow the intern of the other pillar sponsoring this event, the People's Pitzer, Elena, to talk a little bit about the work they do.
Hi there, my name's Elena. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the program assistant for the People's Pitzer through the CEC. The People's Pitzer is a student-focused initiative. It started in fall of 2020 within the Pitzer Center for Community Engagement. The goal of our program is to facilitate growth in the Pitzer community's civic engagement, focusing on education and empowerment, introducing new meanings of civic action, developing strategies for student involvement in community work, and really engaging in the intersection between activism and civic engagement.
Thank you so much for introducing that, Elena. I know that we're both so excited to be here today with the National Lawyers Guild for this Know Your Rights training in this current moment where so much of our organizing is coming up directly in conflict with and engaging with law enforcement.
Shani, I'm not sure if you can hear us, but you might have cut out. So I don't know if maybe Ari, you're able to jump in from there.
Yes, I'll just take it from here. So everyone, thank you for coming today. And as Shani was saying, this workshop is sponsored by our two pillars, the Direct Action Pillar and the People's Pitzer. The Direct Action Pillar was first inspired by Professor Laura Harris, and it is really focused on the work of the community on community engagement and direct action at Pitzer. It holds the goal of organizing and educating the Pitzer community to take real and immediate action to better communities that we are a part of by uplifting existing community organizing and direct action efforts that align with CEC values. So we are very excited to be here to uplift the work that you all are doing today by fighting for the well-being of the folks in the Pitzer community and the surrounding communities and communities beyond this, wherever they may be. So thank you for being here today to talk about this very important topic. And I'm going to next introduce our speakers today. We have from the National Lawyers Guild, we have Rebecca Brown, who is an attorney and legal fellow with the National Lawyers Guild Los Angeles, where she works on numerous projects, including the Mass Defense Committee. Rebecca graduated from UCLA School of Law in 2020 with specializations in critical race studies and public interest law and policy. During her time at UCLA, Rebecca completed internships with the Yale Worker and Immigrant Rights Advocacy Clinic, the American Civil Liberties of Southern California Police Practices Team, and the law offices of Dale K. Filippo, and also volunteered with the Court Watch LA and NLG's LA Legal Observer Program. Prior to attending law school, Rebecca served as a program director with Hunger Free America. Next, we have Krithika, who is the executive director of the National Lawyers Guild Los Angeles. Before joining NLGLA, Krithika served as a staff attorney at the Advancement Project National Office in Washington, D.C., providing legal and policy support to grassroots organizations across the country working to end the criminalization of communities of color and abolish police and policing infrastructure from public schools. Prior to her position at Advancement Project, Krithika was an associate at Arnold and Porter Case Scholar LLP, where she maintained an active pro bono practice focused on education, justice, and criminalization issues. Krithika's background is in youth organizing, and she began her public interest career working in Boyle Heights as the Director of Youth Development at Legacy LA. We also have Benjamin Wood here as our Spanish interpreter. So thank you all for being here today. And with that, I'll turn it over to NLG.
All right. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for getting our presentation on the screen. And thanks so much to all of you for joining us for this training tonight. So just a couple of housekeeping things. We are going to try to reserve some time for Q&A at the end of the presentation, but feel free to drop your questions in the chat. As we move along the presentation, we'll do our best to respond either in the chat or make sure that we address those questions at the very end. So if you go to the next slide, please. So this legal disclaimer we always like to give because it's important, and that is that the information shared in this training and any information we share subsequently during the Q&A portion is not intended to be a substitute for legal advice. So you should always consult a lawyer for advice specific to your individual case. So a little bit about the National Lawyers Guild and some grounding for today's presentation. The National Lawyers Guild, for those of you who don't know, is one of the nation's oldest politically left bar associations and one of the first racially integrated bar associations in the country. The National Lawyers Guild Los Angeles is an explicitly abolitionist organization. We are fascist, pro-abolition, and we recognize as an organization that the function of policing and even our legal system more broadly is to preserve and protect white supremacy and capitalism at all costs. And so we intentionally titled this training a Know Your Rights, Know Your Reality training, because while it is important to be aware of your constitutional rights while taking to the streets to protest, or even more generally in non-protest related police encounters, the reality is that more often than not, police will violate your rights. And because of the severe power imbalance at play between police civilian encounters, protecting your physical safety and coming out of a police encounter alive and unharmed is what's most important. So ultimately, our hope is that this training helps you make more informed decisions when you're participating in protests and helps you more easily spot when police are engaging in unconstitutional conduct. So a quick overview of the agenda for today. We're going to talk about the rights you have in various types of police interactions. We'll go over some common protest-related charges for you all to be aware of. We'll walk through some considerations you should keep in mind before, during, and after a protest. Do a brief primer on Cop Watching 101, and then open it up to Q&A. So when we think about rights and police interactions, we like to think of it in terms of three distinct categories. And so the first two that you see here on this slide are consensual encounters and detentions. But before I get into those, the through line that you're going to see in all of these slides is the message at the top, which is that you do not, and in fact should not, ever be talking to police, answering questions from police, and really engaging with them unless on an absolutely needed basis. So we'll start first off with consensual encounters, right? This is an interesting category because, as you know, the kind of average civilian police interaction can feel extremely intimidating. If anyone's ever been kind of pulled over, right, while driving, your heart rate kind of jumps a little, right? And there's like a natural sort of fear maybe that you feel. And with consensual encounters, even though the encounter is consensual, you may still feel a level of nervousness or intimidation, right? But what's really important is to understand kind of the distinction between a consensual encounter and a non-consensual encounter. And the way we like to kind of describe this is that this is a scenario where the officer is initiating a conversation with you, right? So it doesn't involve any commands, there isn't any force, there aren't sirens. This is maybe an officer casually coming up to you to either ask questions or engage you in conversation. And you have the most sort of freedom and rights in this scenario because you absolutely have the right to walk away, to refuse to identify yourself, and to actually tell the officer, no, I don't want to talk to you, right? If you're in doubt about whether this is consensual or this falls into a detention, which is the next category we'll explore, the sort of magic words, right, that you want to say to an officer to understand what type of encounter it is, am I free to leave? Because in a consensual encounter, you are always free to leave, right? So those are kind of the magic words you want to ask. If they ask to see ID, again, this is in a consensual encounter. If they ask to see ID, you absolutely have the right to refuse. And in California, especially, you do not have to show cops your ID when you are being stopped through a consensual encounter. So if they do ask, can I see your license? You want to follow up with, well, am I being detained? Am I free to leave? And if they're like, yeah, you're free to leave, then you don't have to show them your ID. If in a consensual encounter, they ask if they can search you or your belongings, you also have the right to say no. Now we're going to transition into detentions, right? And this is where it gets a little bit trickier. Detentions are, being detained by an officer is a little bit of a weird gray area because you don't necessarily have the right to leave, but you're also not being placed under formal arrest. So it's a little bit more nuanced, right? And the threshold for law enforcement to detain a civilian is actually pretty low. So if they even have a small iota of suspicion that you were involved in a crime, and again, the bar is very low, they can detain you for further questioning. And in these types of encounters, you don't have the right to walk away, right? You can't refuse to identify yourself or provide ID. However, you always have the right to tell them that you do not wish to speak to them, right? You can always invoke your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. You can definitely refuse to consent to a search beyond a frisk. So going into that a little bit more, right? In a detention type situation, let's say that you are being detained by an officer because a crime has been committed nearby, and maybe they have some investigative questions that they want to ask of you. In this type of encounter, what police are allowed to do based on that very low threshold of having some suspicion to detain you is do a frisk of your outer clothing, right? So maybe they're seeing a bulge in the pocket, maybe they smell weed, maybe they see other drug paraphernalia, in sight, and that gives them kind of an entryway to frisk the outer parts of your clothing and do just sort of a rough pat down. And usually the justification for this is that it's done for the officer's safety or because the officer, has reason to believe that you may have weapons or other contraband on you. When that frisk is happening and they're patting you down, that can then escalate into them actually being able to go into your pockets and bags if they feel something just from patting you down that signals that it might be contraband, right? If they feel a weapon, if they feel a knife, if they feel some drug contraband, that gives them what in the legal field we refer to as probable cause. And that may be a term of art that you all are also familiar with, but it's just a little bit of a higher threshold that allows them to then conduct a more full search. Now, if an officer asks you, right, if they can conduct a more full search, even though they don't have any reason to, you always have the right to say no. So just remember that in these situations, if you are ever given the choice, you always can assert your right not to talk to them and to remain silent. And also if they ask you, like, can we conduct a more full search of your bag, you have the option to say no. And what typically happens with detentions is that ends up leading to an arrest if they have some probable cause to arrest you. So they're starting with the outer pat down. They feel the weapon in the pocket. They reach into the pocket. Turns out it is a weapon. Now they have probable cause to arrest you, right? But in this kind of gray area type of encounter, they either have to let you go or make an arrest. So if that pat down ends up being a bulge in a pocket that they thought was a gun, but is not in fact a gun, at that point, they have to let you go. So that's just something to keep in mind. So then we talk about arrests, and this is a category that folks are probably most familiar with, just given the amount of TV shows, right, in media generally that sort of highlights this type of encounter most often. So an arrest is how you know you're under arrest is typically, outside of obviously having handcuffs placed on you, is having some sort of physical restraint, right, where you're not free to leave. And this arrest is like kind of the highest restraint of your freedom, right? So it does require a higher threshold, and it requires that they establish probable cause that you committed a crime. So it's a stronger standard than what they need to detain you, right? And an officer can effectuate an arrest if there's a warrant, if a felony was committed and they have reason to believe that you committed it, or if some sort of misdemeanor or felony was like committed in their presence, right? And they have reason to believe that you were associated with it. So with an arrest, when it leads to a search, they can search your bag, they can search your person, they can search any items you have on your person. With the Los Angeles Police Department specifically, their policy is to have an officer of the same gender as the arrestee conduct the search, but there is no legal right to have a search be conducted right by an officer who's the same sex as the arrestee. And LAPD is frequently known to not respect requests made by trans and gender non-conforming people in this regard. And so a couple things to remember: obviously, you always have the right to remain silent, and you always should. And you can refuse to provide personal information beyond what is on your license. So, we frequently, the category of arrests that we most frequently deal with is in the protest context. So we've had protesters who've been arrested and they've been asked to, show their license or ID, but then we're also asked to provide like employment information and other things that are just like not within the scope of what they can get from you. So you absolutely can refuse to provide personal information. You shouldn't be giving your social. You shouldn't have to give like your work address or any of that stuff. Obviously, you don't have a right to refuse a search if you're placed under arrest. And here's one common misconception that I wholeheartedly blame the media for, because you always see in your standard TV show or movie, the person is placed under arrest, and as soon as the handcuffs are on, they're being read their Miranda rights, right? That is not how it happens. They do not have to read you your Miranda rights until they question you. And again, Miranda rights, just to clarify, are like what you hear about. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. If you can't afford one will be appointed to you. So they don't have to do that until they actually take you, whether it's to the jail or the station, and start to formally interrogate or question you. The number one thing to keep in mind is that police are legally allowed to lie to you, and they can and will lie to you when questioning you. So it is always, always, always in your best interest to never say anything, even if you feel like, well, this officer seems friendly, or I'm getting a good vibe, or, I wasn't implicated in any way, I didn't do anything wrong, so let me just provide the information they're asking for. You never want to approach it with that mindset, right? Anything you say can and will be used against you. So your best bet is to always remain silent, say as little as possible beyond what's actually needed.
And I'll just jump in and add, along the same lines, police are allowed to have either undercover folks, either at the police station or at a jail if you're booked into jail. That may just, look like another person who's incarcerated. So you also really want to be mindful of speaking, who you're speaking to and being overheard. People are asking you questions, or it's just a good idea, not to really get into any specifics or share any information, because you just don't know who could be listening.
Absolutely.
All right, so we are going to go over some common protest charges, just so these are on your radar when you're going out. We absolutely support people going out and doing acts of civil disobedience. We just encourage everyone to be fully aware, so you're making informed decisions and understand, the potential consequences of your decisions. Unfortunately, we've encountered folks who've been arrested at different actions, and we're not made aware of the consequences of the actions that they were engaging in, and may have thought, there's just a fine you have to pay, and they're actually facing potential jail time. So, knowledge is power. All right, so we'll start off with traffic violations and infractions. So this is basically like getting a ticket. The maximum fine on this would be $250. You're not going to face any like jail time or probation. But it is important to note that if you fail to pay or appear in court, that could lead to a misdemeanor. Things could escalate. On these lower infractions, you're not entitled to a public defender. Things that we've seen in this vein would be something like jaywalking charges or pedestrian in the roadway kind of thing for protests. Misdemeanors are going to be the most common category for a protest arrest. Under a misdemeanor, you can face up to 1 year in jail as well as fines, and you will be entitled to a public defender. And so I'll just go down our list here. I'll let Kritika go into 55.07 because she's more of the expert on that, but I'll jump off with PC 405. That's participating in a riot. A riot is legally defined as people acting together to commit violence or disturbing the peace. We all know that definition is subject to law enforcement's interpretation, and they will interpret things as they want. Another common one is PC 407. That's an unlawful assembly. Pretty similar idea. It's people assembling to do an unlawful act where there's a danger of violence present. One of the most common ones that we see is PC 409, which is failure to disperse. That's remaining at an unlawful assembly after a dispersal order has been issued. There are, through litigation with Los Angeles County law enforcement, there are some requirements for a dispersal order. So that's basically when the police will say, you have 5 minutes to leave this area. Anyone who doesn't leave this area will be placed under arrest or something along those lines. 3 things you want to keep an eye out for is the order audible? A lot of times, they'll just walk back and forth and make it on a small megaphone. So the 20 people closest to the officers can't hear it, but everyone else behind them can't hear the order. They also have to provide you an actual pathways and ability to safely leave. So I've seen plenty of times where they'll make a dispersal order saying you need to leave, they'll start making arrests, but the area is entirely surrounded by law enforcement and there's no pathways out for people who want to leave. They also have to give you adequate time to exit safely. So again, I've seen a lot of times where they'll make a dispersal order and say, you need to leave, you'll be arrested, you have a few minutes to leave. And they just immediately start arresting people. There's no magic number. It's just a reasonable amount of time. And if the dispersal order doesn't meet these requirements and it's not technically lawful, that doesn't mean that they can't arrest you. They absolutely will still arrest you. That will just come into play in the defense for your case. But those are just some things that you want to be mindful of if you're at an action and a dispersal order is given. let's see, another common one that you'll get is trespassing, which is PC 602M. That is being present on property without permission. Another key one is PC 148. This is kind of like a catch-all when they just want to arrest you. It's resisting arrest or obstructing or delaying an officer in the discharge of their duties. The pretty terrible thing about PC 148 is that there does not have to be an underlying offense that you're resisting arrest for, which makes absolutely no sense. So basically, if you're not complying with an officer per their standards, or they just want a reason to arrest you, this is one that they're going to commonly go to. DA Gascon has made a commitment to not prosecute this. There are limited circumstances where it will be prosecuted, but that doesn't mean they're not going to arrest you for it. That's no guarantee for your case, but that is just kind of something interesting to note. And I also want to highlight under this, almost any movement or non-movement can be considered resisting. So if officers are trying to handcuff you and you just kind of go limp, or you don't really like move your body with them, that will still be considered resisting arrest. Or you make your arms stiff so it's harder to handcuff you or move you, that's also resisting. So it's a really broad category. So I will pass it over here to Krithika to go over 55.07 and then 243.
Thank you. So starting with 55.07, this is a local or municipal code ordinance in Los Angeles. So obviously, depending on where you are, this is something, this sort of prohibition may differ. But really, this is a local ordinance that prohibits carrying or possessing certain specified items while attending or participating in a public demonstration, rally, or protest, right? So it's like the types of materials you use to bring protest signs. We frequently advise like activists and organizers to just check the ordinance to make sure that either the signs that they're creating or anything else that they're planning to bring with them to the protest isn't in violation of this ordinance. Of course, when it comes to protests in Los Angeles County and really nationally, the trend is always that the violence starts as soon as the police arrive, and protesters and just civilians in general are criminalized for shielding themselves from that violence. So, one example of a group of protesters who participated in a protest in downtown LA last year in the aftermath of Jacob Blake's murder, we had a group of boogie boarders who had brought their boogie boards to the protest. And the situation got extremely violent with LAPD firing less lethal munitions at protesters. And these folks used their boogie boards as a shield to deflect from that violence. And they were all cited for violating this ordinance, right? So it's just, these are all just kind of the mechanisms through which they really try to criminalize progressive protest activity. And then the other one, PC 243, is also really, dangerous in that the way that it's interpreted, right? So battery on a peace officer. Battery is just a term of art in the legal field for sort of like unwanted touching. And, even touching an officer with your finger could be something that you are then arrested for on this charge. And in fact, we've had cases where a line of officers stood right in front of a crowd of protesters. The crowd moved forward a little, and a protester standing at the very front lost their balance. And he set his hand on the forearm of one of the officers to keep from falling down and was charged with battery. So you want to just be really mindful of where you're placing your hands and your positional, the way you're positioning your body more generally.
Great. And so next we can go into felonies. These are much less common, but not unheard of in the protest context. Felonies are more serious than misdemeanors. They can lead to a state prison sentence in over a year. There's also a lower chance of being released pre-trial, and a higher chance of you actually being booked into jail. On a misdemeanor, you're commonly given a citation. You can see the image of a citation on the right. And there is an important note at the bottom that signing a citation is a promise to appear in court on the date of the citation, but it's not an admission of guilt. We advise that you do sign your citation. If you don't, it's just going to make things a lot more difficult for you. So but back to the felonies. So a common one we have is PC 405A. This is attempting to take somebody from the custody of a police officer. So something you'll commonly see at protests when things start getting really intense with law enforcement. If they're grabbing someone, either enacting violence on them or attempting to take them into custody to arrest them. You may see other protesters jump in and try to pull that person away from the officers. That's what this is referring to. This is a really hard charge to overcome, especially if there's like any kind of video or photo evidence, because it's just, that's what it is. Other offenses that are felonies are things, that include violence, vandalism, arson. One that I also want to put on your radar, we don't have the slide here, is PC 182. That's conspiracy. And I want to bring this up because this is just something you want to watch out for if you're planning, especially something like civil disobedience. You just want to watch your language. So a conspiracy legally is two or more people agreeing to carry out a crime. So, we suggest that you use language more of like, we are willing to risk arrest rather than we're planning to commit this crime and we're planning to get arrested. I also wanted to touch quickly on wobblers. These are offenses that could be charged as a misdemeanor or a felony, depending kind of on the severity. One that we see commonly with protests is 245A1. That's assault with a deadly weapon, which sounds very severe. However, like many things with law enforcement, deadly weapon can be almost anything. Something we've commonly seen from LAPD is this focus with like lasers and lights, and people saying someone has a laser in their bag and that's a deadly weapon. I also wanted to note that picking up or moving police munitions, so if police launch tear gas and people take a canister and throw it back, that will probably be charged as assault with a deadly weapon, which is just super ironic that the police can freely, fire that on protesters. But once protesters try to, touch those items, it becomes a deadly weapon then. And I did just want to touch quickly, a common question we get is the impact of an arrest or a conviction on employment and education. In California, if you're applying for college, the common application will ask for convictions and not for arrest, and you're given a chance to explain the context of that. In the job scenario, employers cannot ask under the relatively new law, employers cannot ask about your criminal history before they make you a conditional offer. So they have to go through the whole hiring process, make you a conditional offer, and then look that up. They also cannot consider arrests that do not lead to a conviction. They also can't look at sealed records or if you're in a diversion program. So say charges are filed against you and you end up getting diversion and not actually being prosecuted, which is kind of another topic. They can't look into that. And I did want to note, federal jobs can be more stringent in this regard. And
Right. Thank you, Rebecca. So now we want to transition to some of the logistical considerations if you're planning a protest or planning to participate in a protest. So we'll start with prior to the protest, right? If you're planning some sort of action, you always want to keep in mind that if the folks you're organizing with have prior arrests or convictions on their record, that getting rearrested or again could lead to increased punishment, right? So you want to keep that kind of front and center. You also want, depending on where you're organizing, and if you're organizing with impacted community members, particularly those who've been previously involved with the criminal legal system and are maybe on parole or probation, then it's also important to note that police contact, right, alone can be a violation and lead to penalties. But then there's even kind of small potatoes that you want to be mindful of, right? Are there folks who may have outstanding warrants or unpaid traffic tickets, right? And unpaid traffic tickets allows them to kind of, it's a gateway to potentially conduct warrant checks. Are there folks with other special considerations for folks around their immigration status, right? And what could be the consequences for people who fall into that category in terms of arrest? Are there medical conditions that you should be keeping in mind, especially if someone is on medication and they need, let's say to take it twice a day. And if you're arrested and you're booked and you're taken to jail, you can't bring your medication with you, right? So these are some of the things you want to really be thinking through. The other thing, to the extent you all are organizing with young people under the age of 18, one thing to note is that a parent or guardian is required to pick youth up when they're arrested, and they will be separated from the sort of adult group. Police are known to be extremely disrespectful to trans and gender non-conforming folks. So just having that awareness front and center as well. And then another thing that we always want to kind of highlight, I guess, are two things, right? So it's always important to do one of these Know Your Rights trainings prior to the protest. Oftentimes, by the time people reach out to the Guild for legal support, as Rebecca mentioned earlier, we frequently see this scenario where folks thought like they decided to risk arrest, but didn't think that the consequences would be quite as severe as they end up being. And so that's always something to keep in mind. And then the last thing is looking at local ordinances wherever it is that you're organizing to see how that could impact whatever action you're planning. So what's one example of that, right? In Los Angeles County, I'm sure it's probably similar in LA, I should say, city of LA. It's probably similar in Claremont and probably more severe, but there is an amplified noise ordinance, right? And so how that could come into play is in the city of LA specifically, activists and organizers oftentimes intentionally plan protests and rallies and other actions in front of elected officials' residences to raise awareness around whatever issue it is that they are highlighting. And so if you're planning a protest or action in front of an elected official's residence or just a residential area more generally, there may be a noise ordinance in place between the hours of, let's say, 4 p.m. and 7 a.m. the next day. And so if you show up with your, bullhorn and microphone, that's an easy reason for police to immediately, declare an unlawful assembly and put an end to the protest. Moving on to some, so one thing that I do also want to flag, I guess two additional things is it's always good to reach out to any groups who are conducting jail support in your community or area. So in Los Angeles, we have Jail Support LA, and we frequently coordinate with them and collaborate with them to ensure that if folks are arrested, right, that jail support is there to be able to provide support. And what they'll do actually is like wait for folks to be released and have food and water and other things and like greet people as they're coming out of jail. And then the other thing, just to keep in mind really quickly, if you are taken to the jail or even a police station, you don't have to provide your cell phone number, social security number, social media handles, email address. You do have to provide the information that is on your driver's license. Your personal property obviously will be taken and booked, but you should always get a property receipt on your way out, and you should get all your property back. And I want to stress this because we've recently had a situation in LA where the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department seized a bunch of cell phones of protesters, didn't return them, and then claimed that they just stumbled upon those phones during the protest, as if people just showed up and decided to, drop their phones to the ground. So these kinds of things happen. You want to be aware of that. If you are taken to jail and booked, you do have the right to make 3 phone calls, but just keep in mind that phone calls are recorded, except for any phone call you make to a lawyer. And then, we shared earlier that you always want to be mindful of what you're sharing, even if it's to someone who is like detained in the same cell as you, because you never know if someone could be overhearing. Moving on to considerations during the protest, right? So what do you want to bring? You want to have your ID on you.
Can I jump in real quick?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Hold on. I got lost in my notes. Never mind.
So in terms of what to bring, you do want to make sure that you have your ID on you. Because it can just delay processing if you don't, right? So you want to make sure that you have that on you. Any medication that you need to take, it'd be good to have it on you. Know that you're not going to be able to take it to jail. So either like make sure you know what it is, or be prepared for it to be confiscated, but then at least you can let the jail know that this is the medication that you're on and that you need to bring. Obviously food, water, comfortable shoes, and just having a plan, right, for possible arrest. So like, especially if it's what we call a high risk action, right, where there's probably a strong possibility or likelihood of you being arrested, you want to make sure that you have folks who are not participating, who will be there to take your call from jail or help post bail money, things like that. And I'll kick it back to Rebecca to lead us through.
Awesome. All right. So during the protest, you're doing the action. Just things to keep in mind if you're able to safely document. We definitely recommend documenting instances of illegal police misconduct, whether it's excessive force, potentially illegal arrest, anything along those lines. I do want to flag for you that right now with ongoing litigation that some of the members of NLG are involved in. There's two different injunctions in place. One against the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department that says they cannot indiscriminately fire less lethal weapons into a crowd. And they also says that they cannot fire weapons that are not targeted at specific individuals, or like not designed to be targeted at a person. So like tear gas, for example, you don't shoot tear gas at one person. They cannot use those weapons to target one person. They absolutely are, still doing these practices, but it is something, just to keep an eye out for when you're on the ground. There's also another less lethal injunction in place for the Los Angeles City Police Department. This is in reference to the 37 and 40 millimeter less lethal weapons. They can only use them in limited circumstances, and they should be at least 5 feet away from the person that they're shooting at. They also cannot aim them at someone's head or organs. Again, they're absolutely still doing this, but just to kind of like to be on your radar there. We also recommend, if you're able to, document the names and badge numbers of officers that you see engaging in illegal behavior. Also document the fact of officers covering up their badge or names. We see that a lot with the Sheriff's Department here. Other things you may want to look for is specific weapons that the officers are wearing, carrying, or what uniforms they're wearing to kind of show which agency they're with. And you also want to keep an eye out for different tactics or changes in things, just to suggest that they may be changing their strategy. They may be getting ready to conduct mass arrests. So if you see a lot of units arriving, or you see them getting to certain formations, may mean that they're about to kind of take action. If you see them with flex cuffs, which are like the zip tie handcuffs, or bringing in buses, again, signs that they're going to stage to do mass arrests. On the other hand, if you see units leaving, it may mean that they're kind of scaling things down. So it's just a good idea to always have situational awareness. So if you're not comfortable being arrested, you kind of know when you may want to leave. After you're at an action and you're decompressing, we recommend that you document any injuries that you may have from law enforcement violence. If you're interested in being connected with legal support in LA County, you can fill out our intake form. So, we don't necessarily provide support right after someone's arrested, like when they're booked into jail, but we can provide support kind of looking more towards the arraignment process in your case, maybe connecting you with pro bono representation, answering any questions you may have. So the link to our form is tinyurl.com/MDC intake. You can also find it on our website for NLGLA. We also have an arrestee FAQ guide on our website that may be helpful. And if you have a court date, please, please, please go to your court date, because you don't want to get a bench warrant. That will just make things more difficult.
Can I just add one other thing that I realized I glossed over, which is what not to bring. So obviously you want to refrain from, bringing any illegal items or paraphernalia, anything that could be considered a weapon. And again, here, think outside of the traditional context of gun, knife, sword. Sword isn't very traditional, but still, to laser pointers, right? Things that they frequently invoked as deadly weapons. And then the other thing with your phone, we always recommend that you lock your phone with a strong passcode rather than having facial recognition or fingerprint as a way to unlock your phone. So just make sure that if it's not set up that way, that you do set it up that way before you go out to a protest. All right. So de-escalation, right? This is a really significant part of engaging in protest activity. Again, this reinforces why we call this a Know Your Rights, Know Your Reality training. In the heat of the moment, you may be fully aware that the police officer is committing misconduct, violating all sorts of civil rights, and yet that is the person with the gun, right? So you always want to ensure that you are saving your sort of like aggressive assertion of your rights for after the fact advocacy, not in the moment, because you don't want to do anything that can escalate the tension even further. So you want to be calm, you don't want to run, you want to keep your hands visible. Now is not the time to kind of argue and say, under the Fourth Amendment, I know that, right? You want to just sort of not resist, because they love to slap a resisting arrest charge on folks. And then even with dispersal orders, right? Maybe after this training, it starts to click to you when you're at a protest, like, hey, they gave a dispersal order, but they barely gave folks any time to leave, and they already started making arrests, right? It's not going to save you in the moment to have that recognition and say something, because they still have the power to arrest you. And so it's just kind of always important to keep that in mind. And then the other thing we always want to flag, right, is the dynamics of white privilege in just general police encounters, but especially at protests. A lot of times, especially in LA, right, the movement community is advocating on behalf of impacted folks, BIPOC and other marginalized identities. And while there may be white allies who show up in support, their actions, especially if they are being more aggressive or escalating things, have really, really, really dangerous consequences for the folks of color around them. And we've just seen some problematic behavior where, things are being escalated by a white person on the ground, and the folks being targeted as a result are the people of color and others around them. So it's just something that in terms of situational awareness, cognitive awareness, and just understanding the privilege that you may have based on your identity, you always want to ensure that you're moving with that in mind.
And I also want to just add, as well, we strongly recommend, if you're a white ally, to follow the leadership of folks who are impacted, who are already organizing it in this space. It's not necessarily your place to go ahead and start your own action, start your own cause. There are plenty of fantastic organizers that understand this from their lived experience, that are doing the work in incredible, impactful ways. So follow their leadership. I love yelling at white people at protests. We get out of control. It's not right.
All right, so a little primer on Cop Watching 101, right? As much as the police will try to make you believe otherwise, make no mistake that under the Constitution, you have a right to cop watch, right? But California's penal code, which is not surprising, does give officers a lot of leeway when deciding what does or doesn't interfere with an officer performing his duty. So the thing that probably kind of like aggravates them the most is when people take out their camera phone and start filming, and their go-to response, right, to try to stop that is that you're interfering with the exercise of this officer's duty. So you absolutely have a constitutional right to photograph and film police in public, but we always caution and urge that folks keep a safe distance while filming. They cannot demand to see your photos and videos without a warrant, but does that mean they will not demand to see your photos and videos without a warrant? No. So they may try to snatch your phone, right? They may try all kinds of things. Know that what they're doing is illegal, but in that moment, again, you want to prioritize your safety. They don't have a right to delete your photos and videos. Does that mean they won't do it? Absolutely not. So that's another reason why, going back to kind of like the passcode, you want to make sure that that's the way you've secured your phone. And so what are the magic words here, right? When you start cop watching and you can tell that the officer is getting more aggressive and is trying to make a case out to seem that you are interfering with their duties. You basically say, officer, I'm not interfering. I'm exercising my First Amendment right to record and document police activity. And in fact, the very provision of the penal code, PC 148, that they frequently arrest folks under for kind of interfering, provides a very, very, very clear right for folks to cop watch, right, and film police. So even though you are constitutionally protected and this is your right to do it, doing it, right, may mean that they're illegally retaliating against you in a number of ways, including with arrest, destroying your device, maybe even bodily harm. So really remain alert and mindful when you're doing it about what the dynamic and what the tension is like on the ground. So what if cops show up to your door after an action? We've had several stories of law enforcement officers showing up to protesters' homes on the premise of investigating unlawful conduct by their own officers, right? That seems like a pretty benign reason, but you should always, always, always be wary of any kind of interaction with law enforcement. And so the number one thing to keep in mind is you do not have to let police into your home unless they produce a valid search warrant. You don't even have to open the door to see the warrant if you have the benefit of living somewhere where you have kind of a window, and you can ask them to put the warrant up through the window so that you can just check to make sure that it's legit. You always have your constitutional right to remain silent. So even if they show up and they want to ask questions, you can invoke that and say you don't want to answer questions. You can let the officer know that you don't wish to talk with them without an attorney present. And right, especially let's say they show up without a warrant, they just want to talk to you. You don't have to let them inside. You don't even have to let them in so far as like the front part of your living room. You can step outside, close the door behind you, and just let them know, like ask them, do you have a warrant? If they're like, no, we just want to ask you some questions, you can say, I really don't want to talk to you without a lawyer present. And again, this can be really intimidating to like invoke in the moment, but just stay calm and remember that like these are your rights, right? And you have every right to calmly assert them. All right, so that brings us to the very end, right? How do we keep us safe, and how do we keep our community safe since we can't really rely on the police to do so? So knowing your rights is an important part of that, but knowing your reality and the power imbalance at play is an equally important part of it. And so the main goal, right, is to be able to escape those encounters alive and unharmed, and then use organizations like the Guild to advocate, right, after the fact. Document everything you can because the police can and will lie. And just remember that although you have a right to cop watch, you can't interfere and you may experience some retaliation from officers for doing so. And with that, we will open it up to any questions that folks have. And feel free to, I don't know how, if folks feel more comfortable dropping it in the chat or unmuting and asking, but want to give you guys the space to do that.
I have a question, and I don't know if maybe this is a much longer conversation or if it's something that can just be answered easily in like a Q&A, but I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what the role of a legal observer is, and like if anybody can become one, or like what that process kind of looks like.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. So yeah, the Legal Observer Program is one of our NLGLA programs, works hand in hand with our Mass Defense Committee program. And so legal observers are these folks you see here in the green hats that go out to actions, and their job is to document law enforcement activities. So any potential illegal conduct by law enforcement, any arrests made, and this information is used both to support folks in their criminal cases that they may get from being arrested at a protest. Also, if lawyers are going to bring kind of affirmative civil litigation, such as these less lethal cases happening with LAPD and LASD, they're also there to serve as a deterrent to law enforcement, saying a lot of the LA County law enforcement agencies are familiar with the green hats to say, someone's watching you. And I think it helps more sometimes, sometimes law enforcement is still going to do what they're going to do, even with the legal observers there. But, it's a really great way to get involved if you, feel like you want to be involved in the protest kind of movement, but maybe you want to do something a little different than protesting. So especially if you're someone who's interested in law school or that kind of path. So if you're interested, you can go to our website, nlg-la.org, and under resources, you'll see the Legal Observer page, and you can fill out our form there, and we will notify you next time we have a training. I don't know if I hope that explains it. Happy to answer any other questions on it. And I also just want to flag, Krithika put I Know Your Rights protest guide, which is a lot of the information that we communicated tonight in the chat there, if you want to download that.
Yeah, that's a great question. We always could use volunteers and interns, and so I think ways to support our work. I definitely encourage folks to get involved and be trained as legal observers. You will go through a specialized training that we conduct, and there will be sort of a small kind of application and other paperwork you'll fill out before officially volunteering with the program. But what's really great about that is you are getting kind of on the ground experience of what police, protester, or even police civilian encounters more generally actually look like. And legal observing is different than cop watching, and it comes with certain special protections. So like one example is the notes that you gather as a legal observer are privileged and are subject to like attorney client confidentiality or work product privilege, which basically just means that those are notes that law enforcement can't just kind of read and take from you, as opposed to the situation where you're kind of cop watching and they may very well try to grab your phone. Not to say that they couldn't always try to grab your notes, but there's that kind of added layer there. So that's definitely one way to get involved. The other way to volunteer is, so usually what happens after folks are arrested at a protest is they fill out the form. Rebecca will drop the link to the intake form that she shouted out earlier in the chat, but they fill out that form, and that's how we get notified that folks need some sort of legal support from the Guild. And what we do after we get that initial form with them is we pair them with an intake volunteer who's also a volunteer who's been trained and gone through a special training with us to conduct a more in-depth confidential interview over the phone to get like really key details surrounding the arrest of that person, right? And any police misconduct that occurred in the course of the arrest. And we then are able to provide those notes to the attorneys that we get to step up and provide pro bono criminal defense representation, or as Rebecca mentioned, if we're thinking we want to file a lawsuit against LAPD or any of these law enforcement agencies, those notes are also helpful in that context. So if you are interested in being trained as an intake volunteer, which is really great because you get to have kind of almost, client contact with folks, you can email Rebecca, and I will drop her email in the chat, and just indicate in the subject line intake volunteer, and that'll kind of flag for her that you're interested in getting involved with that aspect of our program. I think those are kind of like the main opportunities right now. Of course, if you are in law school or know folks who are, obviously this crowd isn't, but if you know folks who are currently attending law school, we also take law student interns to support with various like research and other projects for the organization. So those are just some ways to get involved. Any other additional questions that folks have?
I have a question, if that's okay. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So we've had a couple of instances, both like at the colleges this year and in past years, where folks who've engaged in actions have been like recorded by police or other folks serving as security. And you all talked about, ensuring that only the amount of information that is legally necessary is revealed by protesters. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about how to keep yourself safe in terms of like anonymity at protests, if there's any like tips you all have about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. And I think, in that context, obviously, social justice movements in general, since the dawn of time, have been very, very, very heavily surveilled because of the threat they pose to our current structures in society, right? So that is always an issue, and I think it's important, and one of the things we stress is like you want to try to not make yourself a target as much as possible. Obviously there's a fine line between like having the freedom of expression that the First Amendment grants you to show up to a protest with a shirt that may say F the police, or other like very overtly political forms of kind of expression, and you are well within your right to do that. But to the extent you want to be more anonymous and wear things that are like kind of more nondescript, that's always something to keep in mind, is like how easy is it going to be for them to kind of make you out in a crowd just because of how you're dressed or how you're conducting yourself. So that's
another
something,
thing I
yeah,
would mention on that
please.
point is just, as I said before, just kind of be careful of who you're talking to. It's super common for them to have undercover folks like at protests, and like if someone just comes up and strikes up a conversation with you and you get a feeling that like something's kind of off, or they have weird police shoes because they always have weird law enforcement shoes, don't just be really wary of like who you're giving your personal information to and you're at an action. If someone comes up and it's like, oh, we're going to go to this other action after, let me like text you the information or something like that. Just use your judgment if you feel comfortable sharing your name, your phone number, your email address, things along those lines with folks at Actions.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I see two additional fabulous questions in the chat. So we'll start with the first, which is what range of bail amounts have you seen for people with no priors getting arrested during protests? So, typically the kind of run of the mill misdemeanor protest charges that we ran through. So things like unlawful assembly, failure to disperse. It's usually the way those are dealt with, or at least what we've seen with LAPD, is a cite and release model. And so what that means is you will be placed under arrest. You'll be given a citation, which is kind of the image on the left-hand side that we had up on the slide, but you won't be booked, right? You won't be taken to jail and formally booked or even taken to the station. You're released on site. And that citation is your promise to appear in court at a future date in response to the charge you were arrested on. So typically in that kind of context, right, there isn't even the issue of bail. When you start to move into more of these like felony charges, I think that's when it can get a little bit dicey. So earlier this year in March, on the 1-year anniversary of Breonna Taylor's murder, there was a massive protest in Hollywood that escalated very, very quickly. And a few folks who were, arrested as part of that on some pretty serious charges were held for, 10K, 15K bail amounts. So it really just depends on the charge that you're being arrested for. And there may be like some consideration based on priors, but that usually comes into play once you're actually in front of a judge. So when you're taken, and booked to jail, it's really the consideration is based on, in LA at least, there's a what we call a bail schedule, which is like a list of common charges and the bail amounts associated with those. So it's sort of charge dependent based on what you were arrested for. Rebecca, were you going to add something to that?
Yeah, I was going to add the bail schedule. You can look it up online too. And we're still operating under the COVID emergency bail schedule. So there's a lot of $0 bails. But again, for the more serious charges, there still is bail. So you can, check it out online.
And then the second question, which is a fantastic question, is from Benjamin, which is, I took footage at a march where someone did some street art that police could consider graffiti. Should I publish it on social media? This is a fantastic question because especially in this day and age where everyone has a smartphone and is quick to sort of whip it out and try to film police, right, as a way of keeping ourselves safe. Sometimes in filming that, what folks don't understand is they may have unintentionally captured, someone else committing a crime, right? Unbeknownst to them, they're thinking they just want to film the way police are acting or ongoing police misconduct. But like, since we, the way we talked about how some of these charges are framed and the level of discretion, right, the officers have to make these arrests. If you are filming something and what looks like street art, but could very much be a vandalism charge, we, I think late last year, had a intake from somebody who had sprayed like Black Lives Matter on the sidewalk and was cited with a vandalism charge, right? So you really want to be mindful of what you're posting on social media. Again, thinking back to things like battery, right? Where let's say your video footage unintentionally captures somebody maybe like falling on an officer or accidentally touching an officer. Now all of a sudden there is like video footage on social media of this person committing a crime. I put that in quotes because these are all bullshit crimes, but it is what it is. So you want to be really mindful of that. The other thing to keep in mind is as I mentioned earlier, our movements are heavily surveilled. There's no other landscape that is more heavily surveilled than social media, right? Twitter, Facebook, Instagram is literally like the go-to. And we're talking like officers creating fake profiles, doing all kinds of things. And so you really, really want to be mindful of what you're sharing on social media, especially like, you may have something that you think could go viral, but you want to really be mindful of like whether it could potentially incriminate someone unintentionally. So that's a fantastic question. And I would always err on the side of like if you're thinking about posting, what is the purpose behind it, you know? And if it's to raise awareness about something egregious that an officer has done, really look at the footage 2, 3, 4 times to make sure it isn't, you know, capturing what could be perceived as criminal conduct by someone else. All right, any additional questions? I know we're coming right up at the 6:40 mark, and I know you all have a very exciting event to follow shortly after this, so we don't want to keep you too long. Of course, if you have additional questions that you think of offline, you're more than welcome to reach out to Rebecca and myself. Again, we would love for folks who are based in LA, or even now, because so much of what we're doing is virtual. If you're based in Claremont, but you still want to get involved with NLGLA in one of those two capacities, so either as a legal observer or as an intake volunteer, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And thank you all so much for attending tonight's training and participating. And do we want to share the link to our feedback survey with either Ari or Shani, Rebecca?
I'll send it out after.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for inviting us to come do this presentation. We're so glad we were able to make it happen. And, we really encourage folks to continue to take to the streets to demand justice. That is the sole reason why NLGLA exists, so that folks can feel free to do that without the threat of being criminalized. So do it, continue, getting out there, but just make sure that you're safe and that you're keeping all of these things in mind when you're out in the streets.
Thanks so much, Krithika and Rebecca. And thank you also, Benjamin, for your interpretation services for tonight. We're going to go ahead and stop the recording and close the event. And thanks so much, everybody. Have a good night.